morning, everyone. I've been told actually not to get too excited because my audio cuts out, so I'm going to try to maintain, but I'm excited about today's event. We welcome you to the TD Bank Morningstar Speaker Series. My name is George Longwell, and I'm the Vice President of Engagement at the Greater Washington Board of Trade. As you all probably know, the Board of Trade is known for a robust calendar of events. The Morningstar Speaker Series is one of our favorites because it's designed to bring exciting new ideas to our members and world-class authors and thought leaders. The event series is made possible by TD Bank, which is one of the 10 largest banks in the US with about 26,000 employees and deep roots in the community dating back more than 150 years. TD Bank offers a variety of retail, small business, and commercial banking services to more than 8.5 million customers through its extensive network in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, the Carolinas, and Florida. TD Bank has 55 locations in the greater Washington area and is growing. They've sponsored this series since the beginning, and that's been for more than 10 years. Terry Kenny is TD Bank's market president for the DC Metro, Baltimore, and Delaware region, and he's here with us today. Terry, we can't thank you enough for your dedication and support to this series. Without it, we would not be able to bring you these great speakers like John Feinstein. And we thank you so much, Terry and TD Bank. With that, I'll let Terry introduce today's guest speaker, John Feinstein.
Great. Well, thank you, George. And good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining. And I can't tell you, I mean, TD is honored to have sponsored this Morningstar program for at least the last 13 years. So really fantastic. And today, I'm very pleased and excited to introduce John Feinstein. John is one of the great writers in American sports history, appearing 23 times on the New York Times bestseller list, including 2 books that reached #1. For many years, John wrote for the Washington Post, the Sporting News, and Golf Digest. And he's also been a regular on-air commentator for a number of television and radio programs, including the Golf Channel, United States Naval Academy Football, National Public Radio, Sirius XM, and the Tony Kornheiser Show. John's latest work is in the form of an audiobook, John Feinstein, The Friends I've Made, which we will all have the pleasure of discussing today. The audiobook features 5 of John's most meaningful relationships, captured in a series of conversations featuring personal exchanges with Michigan State men's basketball coach Tom Izzo, golf personality David Feherty, Golden State Warriors head coach Steve Kerr, tennis analyst, sports commentator, and women's journalism pioneer Mary Carillo, and finally Duke men's basketball coach Mike Krzyzewski. So John, thank you so much for being here this morning. We certainly look forward to your presentation and conversation today. And I will turn it over to you, John and George.
Can everybody hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I hope you can see me, although hearing me is far more important than seeing me. Good morning, everybody. Terry, George, thank you very much. Terry, thank you for that introduction. I forgive you for mentioning the Tony Kornheiser Show, but Tony and I are longtime friends, so I'm just kidding. You have to remember when you're on Zoom that because you can't really hear your audience responding, that if you make a joke, they may or may not get it. But I will do my best this morning. Thank you again for inviting me to be here. And as Terry mentioned, this is a brand new project for me. I've written a total of 43 books, 29 nonfiction, 14 mysteries, 12 of them for kids. 2 of them, which I wrote a long time ago, were so-called adult mysteries, as in adults would buy them, not that they were anything evil. I will tell you briefly, since I fortunately have a good deal of time this morning, that when my first mystery came out, it was called Running Mates, and it was actually set in Annapolis, where I had spent several years covering the Maryland State Legislature and the governor when Harry Hughes, who recently passed away, and became a good friend of mine after I left political reporting, was governor. And the book was well received. And in fact, I got a call from my agent at one point saying that Tom Cruise had read the book, liked the main character, whose name was Bobby Kelleher, who was based loosely on me, the biggest difference being that he was a very good college basketball player, whereas I was a completely failed basketball player. I went to college as a swimmer. But Tom Cruise liked the character, liked the book, and was interested in optioning the book. Well, I went home and told my then wife about this, and she said, no, absolutely not. Tom Cruise is a bad actor and he's a Scientologist. And I said, Mary, I don't care if he's a bad actor. I don't care if he's a Scientologist. If he wants to option this book, he's going to option this book. Unfortunately for both of us, Cruise and me, he ended up optioning The Firm. Now, I am a huge John Grisham fan. Love his books, love who he is as a human being. But The Firm, I'm sure many, if not most of you read it. And my opinion on The Firm is that the first 200 pages were the best setup of any thriller I've ever read, as good as any anyway. And the last 200 pages were ridiculous because you had to believe that this 25-year-old kid just out of law school outsmarted the FBI, the CIA, and the mafia. I might buy the first two, not so much the third. So I didn't think The Firm was a very good movie. Some of Grisham's books have made great movies, not that one. Anyway, I digress. The Friends I've Made, as I said, is brand new for me. It's a brand new type of project. An old friend of mine, Bob Snyder, who does podcasts, produces podcasts for a living, came to me and said, why don't we try to find a different idea? Not the usual podcast where you just blather for a few minutes and then maybe interview somebody for 10 or 15. And he said, you've known as many important people, for lack of a better word, in sports as anyone through the years. I've been doing this for a long time now. What if we could put together an audio book where you interviewed a handful of them and talked about your relationships with each one of them? The title is very intentional, The Friends I've Made. When I was a young reporter, I was taught you have to be objective. You can't be biased. You can't take sides on anything. Well, I figured out as I got older that we're all biased. We all have biases for different reasons. It may be because of the way we grew up. More often, it's because you like someone. It's only human to like a person or dislike a person. And what you have to do as a reporter is understand those biases and try to be fair to people, whether you like them or dislike them. Be willing to criticize those you like when they do something that's wrong or make a mistake, and be willing to give credit to those you don't like. The best example in my life is Tiger Woods, who I have said for years, all due respect to Jack Nicklaus, is the greatest player of all time. The way he dominated golf between 1997 and 2008, he did things no one, including Nicklaus, has ever done. He won 7 majors out of 11 at one point in time. He had 9 different years where he won at least 5 times. I mean, just go through the numbers. On the flip side is I don't really like Tiger Woods. I think he treats people badly. I think this new image he's tried to craft in the last couple of years is a bunch of baloney. He has still not sat down with any print reporter to do a real one-on-one since 1998, when he went to dinner with me. Another story for another day. But I just don't think Tiger Woods is a good guy. But I think he's the greatest golfer of all time. The 5 people I selected for this audiobook, and of course they were kind enough to go along with me, are people I've known for many years in all 5 cases. I actually first came up with a list of about 20 and then winnowed it down. And the reason I ended up choosing these 5 is because each in his or her own way has a unique story to tell. Not only that they've been successful, but the way they became successful is full of twists and turns. And I lived through many of those twists and turns with them. And I also knew that because I've known them for so long, that the interviews would be more like conversations. I think when you listen to the friends I've made, it'll sound like two people. I've had people write to me who've listened already to say it sounds like two friends sitting in a restaurant or sitting in a bar, each of the 5 conversations. And what I did with each was I set up the conversation by talking about the person, who they are, how I got to know them, why I like and respect them so much. Then we talked for 30, 35, 40 minutes each. And then I did a kind of epilogue wrap up with each one. So each of them was about an hour long. And I got to say, I really enjoyed doing it. A lot of people have already said to me, are you going to do another one? And my answer is, well, I hope we'll sell enough of them to justify the doing a second one, because I still have this list of a number of other people who I think would be equally good or close to equally good targets as these 5. So let me start and talk for a few minutes about each of the 5 characters. And I'm going to begin with David Feherty, who you may or may not know was once upon a time a very good golfer. He won 5 times on the European Tour. He played on Europe's Ryder Cup team in 1991 and defeated Payne Stewart in the singles matches that wild last day at Kiowa Island. You may remember the so-called War by the Shore. I always hated that nickname because it implied that golf is war. Golf's not war. Golf is golf. And the American players showing up in camouflage before the matches that year was ridiculous. It's golf. But it was an extraordinary weekend of golf. And on that last day, David did beat Payne Stewart. And he tells a story that as the match was coming to a close, they played the 16th hole and David was 2 up. And as they tried to walk from, it was a fairly lengthy walk from the 16th tee to the 16th green to the 17th tee. The golf course at Kiowa Island, if you've ever played there, is fairly spread out. Security had broken down completely at that point. And David couldn't get through the crowds. He was blocked. And as he finally made it to the tee, Payne was already there. The American crowd, of course, opened up a pathway for him. A security guard stopped him and said, hey, buddy, you can't go on the tee. Now, David's wearing his European outfit. You know, the teams all wear outfits each day at the Ryder Cup. He says, buddy, you can't go on the tee. And Payne walked up behind the security guard and said, I understand the sentiment completely because right now he's kicking my butt, but I do need him up here on the tee with me. And David closed the match out on the 17th hole. The United States ended up winning 14.5, 13.5 when Bernhard Langer missed perhaps the most famous 6-foot putt in the history of golf. But David was a very good player. As I said, won 5 times on the European Tour, and in fact finished 4th at the British Open in 1994 when I was researching Good Walk Spoiled. That was the first time I met David. He was 1 shot out of the lead after 3 rounds, and he was brought into the interview room. And when he was finished, and 2 reporters, Dave Sheinin, who now works with me at the Washington Post, but was then at the Miami Herald, and I followed David out. As often happens, you might have a follow-up question when a press conference ends. And David stopped and we introduced ourselves. And when Dave said, I work for the Miami Herald, David looked at him and said, the Miami Herald, really? Do you know Carl Hiaasen? Carl Hiaasen was writing his column in the Miami Herald in those days. And I thought to myself, there aren't many golfers whose first question would be about Carl Hiaasen. Later, he asked me a lot of questions about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. I did work with Bob at the Post, and I still think we are still friends all these years later. He was a mentor to me, especially early in my career. But that's when I first felt like David was not your typical jock. And we became friends as he moved into network television, first at CBS, then at Golf Channel and NBC. I worked with him at Golf Channel when we were both still working there. But the friendship went beyond that. We had a lot of dinners together, and I got to know him. And if you know David's backstory, he probably would have been a much more successful player if he wasn't an alcoholic. And he has fought that battle for years and years. He tells a story about winning the Scottish Open years ago and going to celebrate and waking up miles away, lying on on the 18th green, and didn't know, to this day, doesn't know how he got there. As I said, he's battled that demon. He's battled drug problems too at different points in his life. His wife, Anita, tells a story about their first date when David showed up drunk, and she was trying to figure out why the heck she had let her friends set her up with this guy. When he reached across the table, took her drink and drank it, finished it. At that point, she said she'd had enough. She got up, walked out. David felt terrible about it and called their mutual friend and said, could you ask her to give me one more chance? I know I was terrible. Give me one more chance. And I promise I'll show up sober. And Anita, for reasons she's not really sure about until this day, although she said there was something about him, even when he was drunk, that told her that deep down he was a good person. She agreed to go out with him one more time. He showed up sober. They went to a baseball game and had a great time. David has lived in Dallas for many years, and that's where he met Anita. He went to Dallas because his first wife had left Great Britain in pursuit of another man and moved with his children to Dallas, and he went to Dallas so he could be with his children, and he still lives there to this day. But the second date went much better. They ended up getting married. They now have a daughter, in addition to David's two children from the first marriage, although one of his children, his oldest child, 2.5 years ago now, died of a drug overdose. And you can't imagine, I can't imagine how painful that has been for David to deal with. He's been very upfront about it. He doesn't hide the fact that he feels guilty about it, as any parent would in a situation like that. And in an ironic twist, his other son's name is Rory, given how close he is to Rory McIlroy, that both of them being Northern Irishmen. And even though David didn't know Rory as a kid, he has been kind of a mentor to Rory McIlroy ever since he was a teenager. So that goes back 14 years now, since remarkably Rory McIlroy's 31. And David's son, Rory, served in the military, deployed overseas, and is now a police officer. And as David says, having already lost one child, having another child whose job puts him in jeopardy at times is frightening. But the reason people love David Feherty is his sense of humor. If you listen, again, I'll give away a little bit of what's on the audio. At the very beginning, as we start to talk, I said to David, now look, I tell people that you and I are dear friends. If you want to publicly deny that right now in order to try to fix your image, I have no problem with that. There's a pause, and David says, who is this again? He's so quick. He always has something smart to say. That's what people miss sometimes, I think, because of David's sense of humor. They miss how smart he is, how quickly he can figure things out. And I will tell you a story about David that I don't think is in the audiobook. We recorded all this back in July, so I don't remember everything that's on the book. But in 2005, Tom Watson and I started a charity golf tournament in Bruce Edwards' name. Bruce was Tom's caddy for 30 years, his best friend in life, a good friend of mine. The first person I ever met covering golf was Bruce Edwards. And Bruce died of ALS in 2004. Obviously tragic. Tom and I started this charity event in his name a year later. And David doesn't play golf anymore because he's been in so many bicycle accidents, 3 of them, that he can't play. His back won't allow him to play golf. He hasn't played for years, as good a player as he once was. But I asked David to come in and speak at the event. Now, he and Tom Watson are very close. He says that Tom probably saved his life when he went through his worst times with drinking. Tom is also a recovering alcoholic. He was David's sponsor when he came out of rehab, and they are very close. And so for Tom, far more than for me, David agreed to come and speak at the dinner following the golf tournament. And as David finished that night, with most of the people lying on the ground laughing, Steve Bisciotti, the owner of the Baltimore Ravens, who had played in the event and was at the dinner, walked up to me and said, if you can get David to come to a Ravens game and speak to my friends in the owner's box, I'll give the charity another $50,000. And I took that to David and I said, how do you feel about this? It would mean flying in from Dallas. And he said, of course I'll do it. $50,000 for the charity? Absolutely. We'll set it up. So we did. And I went and picked David up at the airport to drive him to the stadium. And when he got in the car, I said, do me a favor, give me the receipt from your airplane tickets so that we can reimburse you for the flights. And he looked at me and said, I'm not charging you for the flights. What, are you kidding? This is for the charity. I'll pay for my own plane tickets. That's David Feherty. And he, as I said, he's one of the kindest, most generous people I've known. He is, as any of you who have ever watched his show, Farady, which, by the way, Golf Channel has canceled. This has only happened in the last few weeks. In fact, I don't think it's even been announced yet. But Golf Channel, which is bleeding money and has laid off all sorts of people, has canceled the one good show they have other than live golf. And so David, who did the show for 10 years, won't be doing it anymore. But if you've watched Farady, if you've seen him on air during golf telecasts, you know that he's an extraordinarily smart and funny person. And I'm very honored that I can call him a dear friend. And he doesn't deny it publicly for some reason. And I think you will find his segment of The Friends I've Made very entertaining. I don't know how to transition from one person to another, so I will just move on and talk about Mary Carillo, someone else who I've known. I've known Mary for 40 years. The first time I became aware of her when I was covering the 1980 U.S. Open. I was the kid reporter at the Post. I was 9, but I was there basically writing sidebars and caddying for Barry Lorge, the late great tennis writer of the Washington Post. And I'd gone to the U.S. Open as a kid at Forest Hills growing up in New York, so to get to cover the Open in any form was a thrill. And I noticed that this very attractive young woman standing on court as the matches would end, and then she would walk the winner, whomever won the match on stadium court, into the interview room. She was literally the USTA's player escort. That's what she was doing. And I remember saying to Barry, who's that? And he told me that her name was Mary Carillo. And I recognized the name right away because Barry had written about her, dating to 1977, when Mary and her boyhood friend, John McEnroe, won the French Open mixed doubles title. Mary was a very good player. She was ranked as high as 34th in the world in singles before several knee injuries and knee surgeries prematurely ended her career. But she did grow up with McEnroe. They both grew up in Douglaston, New York. They both played at the same small local tennis club. Mary's 2 years older than John. And she tells a story. She and John played all the time. And she tells a story about John as a 10-year-old. Mary was 12. They went out to play one day. And Mary had always been able to compete with John. She was a couple of years older and a little bit bigger at that point. She'd always been able to compete with him. But this day, she said she just couldn't win a point. And he beat her 6-love, and he was hitting all these crazy slice shots and finesse shots and twisting serves that bounced so high she couldn't get to him. And they sat down after they played the 2 sets, and she looked at John and said, you know what? Someday you're going to be the #1 tennis player in the world. And John looked at her and said, shut up. And Mary likes to say that was her first attempt at tennis commentary. And that was the response of her audience. But she went on, as I said, to become a very good player, won the mixed doubles at the French with John. They actually got to the semifinals at Wimbledon, and they were playing Dennis Ralston, very good player, once the #1 player in the US, and Martina Navratilova, who I think you've probably heard of, in the semifinals. And the match went to the 3rd set, no tiebreak. And at 7-all, Ralston hit a shot right at Mary's head. And John was convinced that Ralston had done it on purpose. And so all he wanted to do was try to hit Ralston after that, because he lost his temper. Imagine that, John McEnroe losing his temper. He was 18 at the time. They lost the match 10-8, but they were a very good doubles team. Mary likes to say it was all John, but John will tell you that Mary was a very good doubles player. They're both lefties from New York. When Mary retired because of her injury, she wasn't sure what she wanted to do next. Tennis had been her life. She hadn't gone to college. She turned pro at 18. And she got this job doing escorting players off the court at the US Open, but eventually was hired to do some tennis commentary on some small women's tournaments. And people thought she was good at it, and that was all fine. And then a couple years later, during the old Masters tennis tournament, which was the year-ending men's tournament that was played in Madison Square Garden, she was there working basically as a runner for the USA Network. And she was sitting next to Al Troutwig, who's been working for MSG Network forever, was doing play-by-play on the matches. And Yannick Noah was playing. And during the match, Mary kept handing notes to Troutwig about Noah, about his past, about how Arthur Ashe discovered him when he was a kid, all sorts of things that most people didn't know. And Troutwig did not use any of it on the air. And Mary was baffled because she thought it was good stuff. The match ended, and Troutwig took her by the arm and said, "You come with me right now." And she thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I overstepped my bounds as a runner. And they walked down to the producer, a guy named Gordon Beck. And Troutwig handed all of Mary's notes to Gordon Beck. And he said, "This is what she was handing me during the match. These are things she knows that nobody else knows. Why in the world isn't she doing on-air commentary on the men's matches?" Gordon Beck agreed, and they started using Mary on men's and women's matches on USA. And she was the first woman to ever do commentary on men's tennis matches. And I think one of the first, if not the very first woman to be allowed, quote unquote, to be a commentator on a men's sport. And she eventually became the star at USA. And in 1990, CBS hired her to work during the US Open. The guy who was the tennis producer for CBS is a guy named Frank Cherkinian. If you're a golf fan, you probably have heard of Frank because he basically invented golf television. He started the notion of over par and under par during the Masters in, I want to say, 1958, shortly after CBS started televising it. He was known as the Ayatollah in all of golf and in TV because he ruled with an iron hand. Frank also produced the US Open tennis for USA Network. For CBS at that point. Mary was still working also for USA. And when he was told that Mary Carillo would be one of his commentators in 1990, he said to people, "Why are we hiring her? She's strictly cable." So Mary walked around, everybody had credentials that they wore on their chests with your name and your affiliation. Mine said John Feinstein, Washington Post. Mary took her credential, and where it said CBS USA, she taped over it to say Mary Carillo, strictly cable. Cherkinian never noticed, and everybody else did. And as you know, 30 years later, Mary is still doing tennis commentary for NBC and for Tennis Channel, but she also has worked for, I think, 26 years now on HBO's Real Sports. She's won a bunch of Emmy Awards. She's also worked for NBC doing features for the Olympics. And she's just great. She's just great. And she's also one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. I mean, that's why I consider her to be a dear friend too. But let me tell you one story about Mary that people don't know, or most people don't know. In 2010, you might remember, if you're a tennis fan, you might remember that in 2009, Serena Williams basically got herself defaulted during a semifinal with Kim Clijsters, who ended up winning the tournament because she was called for a foot fault. And she walked over to the lineswoman who had called the foot fault, holding a tennis ball in her hands, and said, "How would you like it if I shoved this tennis ball right down your throat?" Now, Serena Williams is 5'10" and probably a very solid 150 pounds or so. The lineswoman, who was much older, probably was 5'2" and 100 pounds, and she was scared. Can't blame her. Serena was eventually given a point penalty and then a game penalty, and the game penalty ended the match. It's very controversial. She issued a non-apology apology the next day, and then, had to issue another apology for her apology. Mary arrived at the US Open the next year. She was working for ESPN at the time, had a long-term contract. And they had a production meeting about what was going to be in their Sunday preview show. The tournament started on Monday. And nobody brought up the Serena Kim Clijsters incident. So finally, Mary did. She said, what are we doing with Serena's default? And the producer said, well, we're not doing anything with it. That was last year. And she said, the whole show's about last year. It was showing highlights of who won and why and how it happened. That was the biggest story of the tournament. It was bigger than who won. We've got to do something. No, we're not doing anything. And so Mary was baffled and upset. A couple days went by, and during a Wednesday night match, Mary was in her hotel room. The McEnroe brothers were working the match, John and Patrick. And during the match, Andy Roddick got into an argument with a linesman about a foot fault. Now, he wasn't as he was obnoxious, but he wasn't as threatening as Serena Williams had been. And Mary said she lay there in bed. She was in bed in her hotel room, and she lay there in bed and said, okay, when are they going to show the video of what happened last year? Because it was another American, it was a foot fault call, and in both cases, the players were out of line. Never happened, and neither John nor Patrick brought it up. So the next day, Mary went and found John McEnroe and said, what happened last night? Why in the world didn't you guys show the Serena thing, or at least you or Patrick bring it up? And John said, we were told not to. And Mary said, why? And John said, they're trying to hire Serena to work this weekend on the matches. Serena was injured and not playing. And Mary said, what? Yeah, that's why they're avoiding the subject, because they've been told by her agents that if they bring it up, Serena won't work. So Mary was furious. She said, that's it. I'm not working for these guys anymore. And here's a moment of irony. John said, Mary, you need to calm down. You can't let things get to you like this. And Mary said she broke out laughing at the thought of John McEnroe telling her to calm down. But she went and saw the producer and asked if it was true. And he said it was. And Mary said, that's it. And she went home that night, went back to her hotel that night, and resigned from ESPN on the spot. She called her agent, told him what she was going to do. He begged her not to do it, of course, because it involved money for him. And Mary said, no, I can't work for these people anymore. I just can't do it. And she resigned on the spot, has not worked for ESPN since then. This was 10 years ago. But she's continued to be hugely successful. As I said, working for NBC, HBO, and Tennis Channel. And she's great at everything she does. If you've watched her on television, you know what I'm talking about. The only shame of her not working for ESPN anymore is ESPN has now taken over 3 of the 4 major championships. It televises the Australian Open, it televises Wimbledon, and it televises the US Open. NBC still has the French. But we don't get to hear Mary on 3 of the 4 majors except on Tennis Channel. And even then, it's on minor early matches, not any of the big matches. And we don't get to hear Mary with John, which I think was the greatest teaming up of 2 former players in the history of tennis commentary. So that's a shame, but Mary's doing just fine. She lives in Naples, Florida. Her 2 kids are grown. One of them is a very successful actor. Her daughter, Rachel, just became a mother about a year ago. And I will say this publicly without any regret. Mary's got to be the best looking grandmother in America, in addition to just being as good as it gets on or off television. I will now move on to basketball, which of course has been my bread and butter sport for as long as I can remember. I grew up in New York City. I was a huge NBA and college basketball fan as a kid. I was a Knicks fan, which now is just a horrible thing to be. In fact, I can't root for the team because of James Dolan, just as I don't see how fans of the Washington football team can continue to root for it as long as Dan Snyder is the owner. I'm like Jerry Seinfeld. I don't root for laundry. I root for people. So I am no longer a Knicks fan. I became a Celtics fan, actually, when I became close to Red Auerbach, and still maintain some of that, although my favorite team nowadays in the NBA is the Golden State Warriors. And the reason isn't because they won 3 of the last 6 championships or had been to 5 straight finals before this year when they were devastated by injuries, but because of Steve Kerr. And let me tell you a little bit about Steve Kerr's backstory. Some of you may know it, some of you probably don't. Steve Kerr grew up in both Beirut and Los Angeles. And the reason he grew up part-time in Beirut was because his father worked in Beirut. He worked for the American University in Beirut, excuse me. And he and his mom and his 3 siblings spent most of the school year in Beirut. And then they would go to Los Angeles, which is where his parents were from, during the spring and summer, and then go back to Beirut when school started again. And Steve was actually a UCLA ball boy when he got a little bit older. His father came back home for several years and taught at UCLA. And he was a huge UCLA fan and a pretty good basketball player, but not good enough to be recruited by the big time schools, the so-called big time schools. He always likes to joke that he had deceptive speed. People thought he was a step slow, but in fact, he was 2 steps slow. Not really true. He went up, he was recruited by Gonzaga before Gonzaga was Gonzaga. Back then it was a small school that really didn't play on the national stage very much. The coach was a guy named Jay Hillock, and he did invite Steve up for a visit, and Steve played pickup with some of the players from Gonzaga. And at the end, Hillock said, you know what, Steve, I love the way you shoot, but you're just too slow to play for us. I'm sorry, I just can't offer you a scholarship. So Steve went back home. He graduated from high school, and Cal State Fullerton showed some interest in him. And he was tentatively planning to go to Cal State Fullerton, probably as a preferred walk-on unless they offered him a scholarship. He was playing in a Los Angeles Summer League. Lute Olson had come to watch the Summer League looking for juniors, rising seniors actually, because he had just gotten the job at Arizona. Arizona was terrible. They'd gone 4-24 the year before. And he saw this kid who could really shoot. He was with his wife, Bobby, who often came with him to games because they were so close and she loved basketball and knew basketball. And he turned to, the way he told the story, he said he turned to Bobby at one point and said, that kid out there, he can really shoot it. And remember, this is before there was a 3-point shot, but Steve was burying outside shots. And Bobby Olson looked at Lute and said, oh, Lute, he's so slow. You've got to be kidding. And Lute said, we need players. Someone who can shoot can really help us coming off the bench. So we contacted Steve afterwards and asked Steve if he'd have any interest in Arizona. And Steve said, absolutely, of course, I'd love to go to Arizona. Pac-12, it's not UCLA. Actually, back then it was Pac-10, but it's the Pac-10. Yes, absolutely. He said, well, we'll be back in touch. I have to check my scholarship situation. So about 2 months went by. Steve heard nothing from Arizona or from Lute Olson, and he thought he was going to go to Cal State Fullerton. And one day he was kind of moping around the house. This is according to Steve. And his father, who had not gone back to Beirut yet, he was now the president of the American University in Beirut, said to him, Steve, do you still want to go to Arizona? Whatever happened with that? So Steve told him, and he said, well, let's call them. So Malcolm Kerr got on the phone and got Lute Olson on the phone and said, what's happening here? You said you were interested in Steve and you'd get back to him and you never did. And Lute Olson said, oh, well, we heard he was going to Cal State Fullerton. And Malcolm Kerr said, well, that's because he never heard back from you. So are you still interested? And he said, yes, we have a scholarship. And if Steve wants to come, we'd love to have him. So without ever seeing the campus, Steve went to Arizona. And he was, excuse me, the first guard off the bench as a freshman for a bad team. And in January of 1984, his freshman year, he got a phone call in the middle of the night. saying that his father had been assassinated by the PLO. Two assassins walked up behind him and put 2 bullets in his head and killed him. And 2 days later, Arizona was supposed to play Arizona State, its arch rival. They had lost something like 9 in a row to Arizona State. And Steve talked to his mom on the phone and said, "Do you think I should play?" And his mom said, "You know how much your dad loved to watch you play basketball. You should absolutely play. He would very much want you to play. There's nothing you can do right now. Go play." So Steve told Coach Olson, who of course had told him to do whatever he needed to do, that he wanted to play. Steve came in regular rotation, 7-8 minutes into the game. And on the first possession Arizona had, the ball reversed to him. He let go with a long jump shot and it went in. Place exploded. Everybody knew what had happened. Arizona went on to win the game. Steve scored, I think, 14 points. And from that day forward, he became an adopted son in Tucson. In fact, every time Steve would make a basket, the public address announcer would go, basket, or later, by his senior year, the 3-point shot did exist. He would say, 3-pointer by Steve Kerr. And the whole crowd, 12,000 people, would scream back, Steve Kerr. I was in the building on a number of occasions, excuse me, for that. And I'm telling you, you got to chill every time. By the time Steve was going into his senior year, the summer of 1986, he was not only a starter, but good enough to be selected for the United States team in the World Championships in Spain that year. David Robinson was on that team, among others. And the U.S. won the gold medal, but in the semifinals, Steve tore up his knee. And back then, an ACL injury was often career-ending. And he didn't know. The doctor said, well, you rehab it and hope. So he rehabbed, he redshirted that year, was supposed to be his senior year, 86, 87. Came back 100% as a senior, and Arizona went to the Final Four. Great team, great story. They won 35 games, but they lost in the semifinals to Oklahoma, the Oklahoma team coached by Billy Tubbs, who just passed away a week ago. Excuse me. And Steve, who was a 61% three-point shooter, think about that number, during the season, shot 3 for 12 in that game. When we did the interview for this audiobook, I said something like, so I know, because we've discussed it, how disappointed you were when you shot 3 for 11 in that game. And he said, John, it was 3 for 12. And he has often said that he would give up 3 of his 5 NBA rings to have that game back, to be able to win that game and play Kansas in the championship game. That's how much it meant to him, and how disappointed he is 32 years later about that game. Blames himself for the loss. Oklahoma was really good. But he graduated and was thinking that maybe he might have a chance to make an NBA team. He was drafted in the 2nd round by the local team, the Phoenix Suns, made the team, ended up bounced around for a couple of years, went to Orlando, and as I think most people know, landed with the Chicago Bulls just when Michael Jordan was coming back from his first retirement. And if you watched that Jordan documentary this summer that I didn't watch, because I never watch anything that's controlled by the guy who it's about, Jordan had final say on all content. But apparently Steve talked in detail on the documentary about the fight he and Jordan got into the first day of practice because Jordan wanted to test him. Steve ended up making the winning shot in 1997 in Game 6 of the NBA Finals when the Bulls won the second of their three consecutive titles that they won during Jordan 2. And Steve and Jordan became close friends. Steve ended up going to San Antonio, where he was reunited with David Robinson, was on 2 more championship teams, retired, went into television. I don't know if you've ever seen him on television. He was great because he was honest. He didn't make excuses for people like so many of the analysts do nowadays. He just told you what he saw and what he thought. But he had kind of an urge to get back into the NBA and became the president of the Phoenix Suns for a couple of years. He actually commuted. His family was living in San Diego at the time. His kids were young. And he would get on a Southwest Airlines flight at 6:30 every morning, fly to Phoenix. It was 48 minutes or something, spend the day working, and then fly home and get home in time for dinner. That worked out, although it wore him out, you might imagine. But the job didn't go so well. He made a bad trade for an over-the-hill Shaquille O'Neal. The team slipped, and Steve left and returned to television for several years. But the itch was still there. And 7 years ago now, both the Knicks with Phil Jackson, who'd been his coach in Chicago, running the team, and the Golden State Warriors were interested in hiring him to coach. By then, his kids were grown. He and his wife, Margot, were empty nesters. They have 3 children, all of them out of college now. And he was ready to take a job that would mean a lot of travel because the kids were grown. And he had a choice, the Warriors or the Knicks. He made one of the smartest decisions in the history of sports. Took the Warriors job, stayed away from the disaster that is the Knicks, and that was the Knicks under Phil Jackson, won 3 NBA titles, went to 5 straight finals. Now, the other part of Steve that I should mention is that he's very outspoken politically. You might remember that the Warriors refused to go to the White House when Trump was president. He's still president for another 70 days. Excuse me. On a couple of occasions. Instead, they went to Kevin Durant's school. Kevin Durant, after the second title, Durant grew up in Prince George's County in the inner city. They went to his school. They picked up a bunch of kids from the school and took them to the African American Museum. And Steve told me it was just a great day. He's very outspoken about gun control. What a surprise. His father was killed by guns. And is very unpopular with a lot of right wingers. He has no problem with that. He's as bright and articulate as anybody I've known in sports. We're still good friends, I'm happy to say. In fact, we taped this interview on July 28th, which is my birthday. And Steve's parting comment to me was, I hope you can find a restaurant tonight that's both safe and that will be willing to serve you a drink. Maybe because I'm too old to drink, certainly not because I'm too young to drink. But remarkable man, Steve Kerr, and obviously a very good basketball coach and still a young coach. Steve will coach for a while longer if he wants to. And I suspect he'll want to because he loves basketball. Speaking of coaches, let me move on to Tom Izzo, who you may have heard in the last 24 hours has COVID-19. He says the symptoms are mild. I hope that he will be okay shortly because we're all hoping the basketball season will start on November 25th, which is 2 weeks from tomorrow, I believe, if I've got my dates right, or maybe it's 2 weeks from today. I lose track. Many times I don't know what day of the week it is. I'm sure you all have the same problem at this point in time. Tom Izzo played Division III basketball, grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, was a D3 player, but always knew he wanted to coach. And he landed at Michigan State where he worked for Judd Heathcote. I'm telling you, Tom could write an entire book on his experiences with Judd Heathcote, who was a great coach, Coach Magic Johnson, won a national title, and had a great sense of humor. When I was doing Season on the Brink, Judd told me that Knight often called him and said to him, Judd, you're the only coach in this league who likes me. And Judd would respond and say, Bob, I wouldn't be too sure about that. You might be 9 for 9. There were 10 teams in the Big Ten back then, unlike now when there were 14. But Tom worked for Judd and wondered if he'd ever get his chance. It seemed like Judd was going to coach forever. Finally, in 1995, Judd retired and Tom took the job. And much like Mike Krzyzewski, who I'm going to talk about in a couple more minutes, his first 3 years were very difficult. And he wondered at times if he was going to survive as the coach, because they finished at 500 2 years in a row. And finishing at 500 when you're in the Big Ten, the ACC, the SEC, any of the big time conferences is very unimpressive because all these teams schedule guarantee games. And a guarantee game is a game you play at home against a smaller school. You guarantee them a certain amount of money for coming to play, and they're supposed to guarantee you a victory in return. Sometimes the guarantee games, the visiting team forgets about its end of the bargain. And to me, those are the best games in college basketball every season. I love it when someone who's not supposed to have a chance to win goes into a big time gym and wins. I mean, as much as I love Mike Krzyzewski, I thought it was a great story last year when Stephen F. Austin, as a 26-point underdog, went into Cameron Indoor Stadium and beat Duke. Excuse me. But Tom did survive. His recruiting picked up. In 1998, his team made the NCAA tournament for the first time under him. A year later, they were in the Final Four, where they lost to Duke. And since then, the next year, they won the national championship. And a year later, they went back to the Final Four again. So 3 straight years in the Final Four, including a national title. Now Izzo's a star. He's been to 8 Final Fours in all, won that national championship. He's frustrated he hasn't been able to get the second one, but his team is consistently one of the best in the country. And again, Izzo is a guy everybody respects, not just because he wins a lot of games, but because of who he is. And I've gotten to know him. I really got to know him, interestingly, in 2001, when I was working on the old BB&T Classic. Those of you who are local probably attended it if you're basketball fans. Maryland and George Washington were the hosts, and we would bring in 2 national teams every year. And when Tom was the defending national champion, I'm trying to get the best teams I possibly can. I went to talk to him at a summer camp about coming to play in the event. And his first reaction was, well, I don't know. We don't recruit out east. And I said, Tom, it's for children's charities. We give all our money, all the money we make, to kids at risk in the Washington area. And he said, really? And I said, yes. He said, we'll come. And they did. And we sold out whatever, Verizon Center or whatever it was called back then, 2 days in a row. Thanks in large part to the presence of Michigan State. Also because Maryland was really good back then. As you might remember, they went on and won the 2002 national championship. Let me throw in one quick thing about Gary Williams here. When we were trying to start that event in 1994, from ground zero, Pete Teeley was the chairman of the board, asked me to come on the board. I had written a column years earlier saying there should be a charity event in Washington, since we now had 2 national powers in Maryland and Georgetown and all sorts of other good teams. GW was good, American was good. When I wrote the column, David Robinson was at Navy, and Pete had read the column and said, help me put this together. So I did. And Georgetown wouldn't play. That's a long story for another day. But when I called Gary Williams and told him what we were trying to do, Gary's response was this: you get it put together, we'll be there. And he was every year. And every year he would call me after the tournament if they lost and tell me he could never play again because his fans were all over him for losing those games. And I'd say, okay. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, Gary would call me and say, so who do you want us to play next year? That's who Gary was and is. But Izzo came and played. We became good friends. And in fact, 2 years ago, I guess a year and a half ago now, when Michigan State came in to play in the East Regional in 2019, I had dinner with him on Saturday night. They were playing Duke in the regional final. Remember, Duke was unbeatable. They had the greatest player in the history of basketball, Zion Williamson, on the team. They were completely unbeatable. There was no way they could possibly lose. I didn't like the team that much. I mean, they were talented, but I thought they were soft. And I thought in a close game against a hard-nosed team like Michigan State, nobody's teams play harder than Tom Izzo's teams. Excuse me. That they would lose. I thought Michigan State would win the game. And I told Tom that. I said, I think you're going to win tomorrow. And Tom was like, I don't know. I mean, they're so good. They have this, that. And I said, Tom, you know as well as I do that you have a chance to win this game. And I think you're going to win because I think the tougher team wins in the end. They ended up winning the game by 1 point. I went out on the court right after the game, and Izzo came up and grabbed me and said, you were the only one who knew. And I said, no, I wasn't. You knew. And he said, yeah, I did. But that's blind squirrel and acorn stuff. I mean, if I had $1 for every wrong prediction I'd made, I wouldn't be talking to you guys right now. I'd be on my island somewhere. But I did get that one right. And I think Krzyzewski knew it too. So I'll transition from here because we're coming up on 11 o'clock to Mike Krzyzewski. I saw Mike Krzyzewski play at Army. That's how old I am. I saw him play in the NIT for Bob Knight in 1968 and 1969. And then I first got to know him when he was the coach at Army. for 5 years. I was kid reporter at the Post, and he was one of those guys who would take my phone calls. So we became friends then. And then, of course, he ended up at Duke. And we have been good friends for many years now. And he often tells the story about the night in 1983. As I said, like Izzo, his first 3 years at Duke were a struggle. He was 38-47 after 3 seasons at Duke. 38-47. Think about that. 10-17 and 11-17 in years 2 and 3. And they lost the last game of that third season, 109-66 to Virginia. And Ralph Sampson was on that Virginia team, and they were crushed. The game was in Atlanta in the old Omni. And the last game of the night was between Maryland and Georgia Tech, and I was covering Maryland. And Keith Drum, a good friend of mine from the Durham Herald, who ended up as an NBA scout, and I were sitting there watching the game. And Bobby Dwyer, who was then Mike's #1 assistant, who grew up here. You might remember the name Bob Dwyer. He coached at Archbishop Carroll for years, coached John Thompson when John was in high school. But Bobby was his son, played at Wake Forest, and he was now Mike's #1 assistant. And he comes into the arena and sits down while we're watching the game. And he says, when this game is over, you two guys need to come out to our hotel. And we looked at him and said, why? And he said, Mickey, Mike's wife, is in the room crying because she thinks they're going to get fired. Tom Butters, the athletic director, is in the lobby fending off Iron Dukes. Those are the boosters who want Mike fired. And Mike is pacing around wanting to kill somebody. You got to help me get him out of the hotel. Keith had been the one member of the North Carolina media who had said for 3 years, give Krzyzewski time. He's going to get this done. Remember, Dean Smith was God in North Carolina. Jim Valvano had become, I don't know what you want to call him, become a legend. And of course, that year they went on and won the national championship, which made it even worse. Excuse my nose itch. I apologize for that. And Mike had gone 10-17 and 11-17. So when the game was over, we got in Bobby's car. It was well after midnight. We drove out to the perimeter of Atlanta because Duke was staying out there. And Bobby, Keith, myself, Tom Mickle, who was the Duke Sports Information Director, his assistant Johnny Moore, and Mike got in 2 cars, and we drove to a Denny's. And by now it's 1 o'clock in the morning. It is pouring down rain. It's miserable out, which sort of fit the mood. We walked in, we sat down at a table. The waitress served us, gave us waters. Tom Mickle picked up his glass of water, and he said, here's to forgetting tonight. Krzyzewski picked up his glass of water and said, here's to never blanking forgetting tonight. And he was very serious. And he talked that night about how it would be easy to blame someone else for the failures of this team, but it all came back to him. And again, remember, he went to West Point, where when you're a plebe, you're allowed 3 answers if an upperclassman asks you something. Yes, sir. No, sir. No excuse, sir. Mike Krzyzewski is the ultimate no excuse, sir guy. And he said, this is on me. And he said, look, they had a great freshman class. They had Johnny Dawkins, Mark Gallery, David Henderson, and Jay Billis. And Tommy Amaker was coming in to give them a point guard and let Dawkins move to the 2 spot. And he said, if we can't win with these 4 freshmen and Amaker next year, we should get fired. Referring to him and his staff. And sure enough, they won 24 games the next year. They beat North Carolina in the ACC tournament, Michael Jordan's last ACC tournament game, in one of the great games I've ever seen, and went on to the NCAA tournament for the first time since Krzyzewski had gotten there. And you know, the rest is history. 2 years later, they were in the Final Four. And since then, they've won 5 NCAA titles and been to 12 Final Fours. In 2010, I was writing a book about my first 25 years of writing books. And much of it was going back to people who had been in previous books to kind of update people where they were, what they were doing. People who weren't famous, like Damon Bailey, who was the 8th grader I wrote about in Season on the Brink, and golfers and various people. And I called Krzyzewski and I said, hey, next Tuesday or whatever it was, you're playing at UNC Greensboro. It's going to be your 880th win, which would be 1 more than Dean Smith. And going back to that night in the Denny's, the thought that Mike Krzyzewski would end up with more career victories than Dean Smith was about as plausible as the idea of flying to the moon in a jetpack, with a jetpack. And I said, I want to come down, spend the day with you, spend some time and talk about those days. And when Duke won the national championship for the first time in 1991, when I walked on the court, I put out my hand to congratulate Krzyzewski. And before I could say anything, he pulled me close and said, we've come a long way from the blank in Denny's, haven't we? So he never forgot. To this day, he hasn't forgotten. And so I called him and said, I wanted to do this. He said, yeah, sure. Come down, meet me at the office at 2:30. You can ride the bus with us to Greensboro. We can talk on the bus. And then when we get there, there'll be a couple hours we can spend in the locker room and talk some more. Will that be good enough? And I said, that's great. So I drove down to Durham on the day of the game, and I met two friends for lunch. One was Mike Craig, who is now the athletic director at St. John's, who was Mike's fundraiser then, and basically his man Friday. I mean, you didn't see Mike without Mike Craig, either right next to him or right behind him. The other was a guy named Bill Brill, who'd been a mentor of mine, Duke graduate. He had retired to Durham a few years earlier. And we went to lunch together. And during lunch, Mike Craig said to me, so when are you going to talk to Coach K? And I said, well, on the bus going to Greensboro. And he said, you came all the way down here to talk to him on a cell phone? I said, no, I came all the way down here to talk to him from the next seat. And Mike Craig said, no, you must have misunderstood something. Nobody rides that bus who's not directly part of the team except for Mickey. He said, I don't even ride that bus. And I said, well, tell me what I misunderstood. And I walked through it. And he kept shaking his head saying, I don't understand. Why would he let you do it? Why would he let you do that? And I finally said, because I was in the blanking Denny's. And that's really the truth. That's why Mike Krzyzewski, when I call Mike Krzyzewski, he calls me back. When I text him, he texts me back. Makes his sports information director crazy because I don't go through the system. And why should I? I've known the guy for more than 40 years. And that's what I've told the sports information director. I know we want to stop here, George, for questions. So I'll stop here for questions.
John, that's tremendous. Who would have thought so many great things happen at Denny's? And so thanks for sharing that. So I actually wanted to start with picking up on Krzyzewski and your coverage historically in West Point football and other service academies. Has that had any impact on you? Any unique insights that you take away from that on the service academy side of things?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, I could do an entire audio book just on my relationships with people at the academies. I mentioned earlier I've written 43 books. I think the one I'm emotionally closest to is The Civil War, which was my book about the Army-Navy rivalry. I did Navy radio football for 14 years. I now do pre and post game stuff for Army. I believe I'm the only person, I could be wrong, but I believe I'm the only person not directly connected to either team who has been in both locker rooms before and during an Army-Navy game who wasn't president of the United States. I sort of cite that as one of the cool things about my career. I'm still very close to many of the young men. My instinct is to call them kids, but they're not kids anymore, who I wrote about in that book. I was invited back for both of their 20th anniversary get-togethers a few years ago. And in fact, the two of the captains, Jim Cantaloupe from Army, Andrew Thompson from Navy, and I were planning a 25th anniversary for both teams to get together because the rivalry is unique and they do understand one another so well for this year. But COVID has forced us to call it off, and we're hoping maybe to have it next year on the 25th anniversary of the publication of the book. My dad served in the Army in World War II, served overseas and received a Bronze Star for a sniper incident that took place when he was on the island of Saipan. So I have strong feelings about the military in general, and I have great respect for people in the military. That doesn't mean I don't support those who have chosen, dating back to Colin Kaepernick, to kneel for the national anthem, because as all of my friends from Army and Navy have pointed out, no one is trying to disrespect those guys. I would never disrespect those guys. But I do have strong feelings about the military, and it's kind of appropriate that you bring that up since today is Veterans Day, or tomorrow Veterans Day.
You're right. We're in that time.
Tomorrow's Veterans Day.
No, that's a great takeaway. That was one of the questions we had. And then also, just as a reference here, there was a note about an article that you'd written on Chris Street from 2018. It's tough for me to bring up Iowa since I'm a Michigan State fan and would have preferred to talk about Izzo further. But apparently, this was really an article where you touched this person, and they said that it was hard to put into words how much Chris means to Hawkeye basketball in the state of Iowa, but you did, and they were thanking you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. I saw Chris Street's last game in 1993. Iowa was coached by Tom Davis at the time, and they played at Duke in a nationally televised game, and I covered the game. And Chris Street was as intense and competitive a player as I've ever seen. And during the game, there were some scuffles. And I never forget this. I'm pretty sure I wrote it in that column you're referencing. At the end of the game, Duke was up by 7 or 8 and was going to win, final 10 seconds. And Bobby Hurley, who was just as competitive a player as Street, went to the foul line. And as he's walking up to the foul line, Chris Street walked up behind him and tapped him on the hip and said, "Good game, Bobby, no hard feelings." And they shook hands and hugged when the game was over. And 3 nights later, Chris was killed in an accident in Iowa City on his way back from a nighttime class. And I remember it vividly, George, because I was covering a game that night in Philadelphia. And I was driving home and I was listening to, sports radio. And they came on with a news update. And the guy said, Iowa sophomore, I believe Chris was a sophomore, Chris Street was killed tonight in an automobile accident. And I remember I had to pull over. I had to pull my car over. I mean, I was so stunned and shocked. And right over here on the other side of my room, of my office here, is a book written by a longtime Iowa beat writer about Chris Street. And that's how much of an impact he did have, even in his very short life.
Thank you, John. Also, apparently, Bobby Knight banned you from Indiana after a season on the brink. Did you ever get to be friends with him?
I wouldn't say we got to be friends, but we did make up to a certain degree. I was banned from a game, an Iowa game actually, the following season. They just said there was no room for me, no room at the end, and I ended up going on national TV that day during halftime. I mean, Bob helped me sell the book with things like that. And Ahmad Rashad said to me, "John, Coach Knight's called you a pimp and he's called you a whore. How do you respond?" And I said, "Well, I wish he'd make up his mind so I know how to dress in the morning." And I've used that line for years. But the next time Bob and I spoke was 8 years later in Hawaii. I was actually with Maryland covering the Maui tournament. Indiana was playing. And Gary Williams and I ran into Bob and a friend of his in the lobby. And I remember as we saw them, because we were coming perpendicular and we were clearly going to cross paths, I remember Gary saying, "Oh, here we go." And Bob turned around and said, "Hey, John. Hey, Gary, how's it going?" Like nothing had happened. And we chatted for several minutes. Bob asked me about my son, who had been born several months earlier. How was it going? How did I like being a father? And it was like we were just old friends running into one another. And after they walked away, Gary said to me, "What was that?" And I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "After all the things that he's called you, after all the names he's called you, why would you speak to him?" And I said, "Gary, he built my house." But the one long conversation he and I had was when I was doing the Red Auerbach book that I wrote. And because he loved Red so much, Bob agreed to talk to me, and we talked on the phone for 2 hours. And that's the thing about Bob Knight. When he's good, he's great. And
right.
Somebody said to me on the phone last night, it was Cliff Ellis, the old Clemson coach, who's now at Coastal Carolina. And he said, "Donald Trump and Bob Knight are the same person." I said, "No, there's a difference, because for all of Bob's flaws that Trump has, being a bully, being a know-it-all, refusing to admit when you're beaten, as we're seeing right now, Bob has a heart. There's another side to Bob Knight that really cares about people. That side doesn't exist in Donald Trump."
What inspired you to write? And there's a second part to that question. Do you believe that we have a lot of business people on the call today? Do you believe that sports is a path to leadership?
Okay, what inspired me to write is that I wasn't a good enough athlete to become a professional. And sports was always my passion. Politics, my second passion, as you might be able to tell. And excuse me. But when I got to college, as I said, I went to college as a swimmer, broken ankle, falling down a flight of steps, sober, which is pretty embarrassing. And I always enjoyed writing in high school, creative writing and things like that. Learned to read, reading the newspaper. I would get up before my parents and the New York Times would be at our apartment door, and I wanted to know how the New York teams had done. So I more or less taught myself to read, reading the New York Times sports pages. So I went up to the student newspaper, the Chronicle, and I was very lucky that the first person I met was a woman named Ann Pelham, who was the editor of the Chronicle. Ann Pelham was about 6 feet tall and was wearing shorts. And she started telling me if I really wanted to be a journalist, I had to write about more than sports. And if Ann Pelham had told me to stand on my head in the corner for a week, I would have done that. I mean, come on, I was 18 years old. And so I did. I wrote news and sports throughout my time at Duke. And that turned out to be very important for me because I got a summer internship in sports at the Post when I graduated. The end of the internship, there were no slots open in sports, but I was offered a job as the night police reporter. And because I had experience in news, I had a clue what I was doing. I ended up being on the Metro staff for 4 years. That's when I met Bob Woodward, who taught me more about journalism. It was like getting a PhD in journalism working for him. And then eventually went back to sports because it was still my first passion. Oh, and the question about leadership.
Yeah.
I think you can find leadership anywhere. Certainly great coaches are great leaders. That's the most important thing I've learned about people say what makes a great coach. Obviously, in the college level, recruiting is part of it. As Dean Smith used to say, the key to being a great coach is having great players, and there is something to that. But you've got to get the great players or the good players or the not so good players to buy into what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish. And I think the most important thing about coaching is communication. It's not X and O's. I can X and O, you know. I understand. I mean, crying out loud, I watch Bob Knight run practice every day for an entire season. I know a little bit about X's and O's, but I'm not that kind of communicator. And very few people are. The best coaches are the best communicators. And I think that in any profession, if you have a chance to influence younger people, you should do it. I try all the time to talk to younger people. I taught for several years. I taught at Duke for 3 years, not a sports journalism class, a journalism class. Again, getting back to my early experience. And I love doing it. I loved several of the kids I taught have gone on to be very successful. One of them being Barry Svrluga, the columnist for the Post, and a number of others, Seth Davis at CBS and The Athletic. But I always wanted to try to influence younger kids. Now, a few years ago, when I was working for the BB&T Classic, Bob Chernak, who was a vice president at George Washington, asked if I had any interest in teaching. Well, my mom taught at George Washington. So I thought that was a great idea. Local, didn't have to go down to Duke like I'd done. And I said, yeah, I'd love to. And he came back to me a couple of weeks later and he said, well, the head of our journalism department has never heard of you, but she says you can submit a resume if you want. Well, I've never had a resume, so that didn't go much farther.
There's a good consensus building in the chat room for you to consider coaching. Is that something you've considered?
A lot of people who read my stuff think I should consider coaching. Several years ago when Frank Sullivan was still the basketball coach at Harvard, still a close friend of mine, as is Tommy Amaker, who succeeded him, he and I actually talked very seriously about me coming and spending a year as a volunteer assistant because Harvard only had 2 assistants. Most schools had 4, have 4 these days or more. And I thought that would be a great thing to do. I love the idea. I love the idea of coaching, trying to coach, learning more about coaching, the idea of living in Boston for a year, being at Harvard. And we were all set to do it. And then Frank got fired, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, that's also in line with what you're saying about youth and investing in kids. And so that's great. wanted to ask you also, since we're in COVID right now and it's apparently not getting better for the
It'll
moment,
get worse before it gets better, George.
right? What do you have any sense of what this means, to DC area sports and also more broadly to sports overall? What kind of impact has this had?
The honest answer is I don't know, because I don't think we'll really know until we start to flatten this, and until we find a vaccine. I hope the Pfizer vaccine turns out to be a real thing, but it's clearly already had an impact. It's impacting schedules. It's impacting athletes. The NCAA is going to have a basketball tournament this season, because they lost $450 million in TV revenue when they didn't have a tournament last year. And several coaches, among them Mike Krzyzewski and Tom Izzo, have been on a committee all summer long with Dan Gavitt of the NCAA, who may be the one competent person working at the NCAA, making plans to try to have a basketball season. And the one thing that is fail-safe in their discussions is that there will be a tournament, one way or the other. And as Krzyzewski said to me a couple of weeks ago, if we have to play in July, we'll play in July. So that's why I'm saying we can't know. Even now, there are teams, today's November 10th, I think I finally figured that out. The college basketball season is supposed to start November 25th. There are teams that still don't know their schedules. The Ivy League doesn't know if they're going to play no games or 14 games, just play the regular Ivy League schedule. Will they have a tournament? The NCAA has already trademarked the phrase "battle in the bubble" in case they have to go to a bubble to have a tournament. So the impact's going to be tremendous, and I don't mean that in a positive way. We just don't know how big it's going to be yet, because we can't know until we sort of at least see the light at the end of this tunnel.
That's right. That makes sense. If you were going to add to this list, but specifically add from the DC area, your list meaning the people, the friends that you've included in your book, if you're adding, who would it be here from our area? Who would be the next to the list?
Well, earlier, before John Thompson passed away, he would certainly be right at the top of the list. He and I fought like cats when I covered Georgetown, when they were great in the 80s, because John was very protective of his players, and I wanted access to his players. And we had many battles, but we respected one another. In fact, one time, when I won't bore you with the details, but I very stupidly offered to go outside and fight John Thompson because I got into a thing with his alter ego, Mary Fenlon, and John got very angry with me. And I said, come on, let's go outside. Let's settle this outside, because Will Jones, the late Will Jones, who won a national championship at UDC, played at American, grew up here, played against John in high school. And Will had told me when I was researching a magazine piece that John was soft as a player, that even though he was 6'10", he always stayed outside and shot jump shots. And that the irony was that his teams played such physical defense. So I said, if Will Jones is right about you, I'll kick your butt. If he's wrong, you'll kick my butt. But let's go outside. And John started laughing, thank God, and put his arm around me and said, you know something? He used his favorite word, which I won't repeat in front of all these people, but the first half of it is mother. You know something, mother blank? I don't like you. I don't like you one bit, but I respect you because you're crazy. And so there was always that mutual respect, and it grew into a friendship later, to the point where I frequently went to John for advice and guidance. And in fact, I'm currently working on a book on race in sports. And it was John that I went to a couple of years ago to say, I know I want to write this book, but how do I get started? Where do I begin? Because it's such a huge subject. And John looked at me and said, you might as well try to explain the Holy Trinity. And then added, which is why you need to do the book. And those words have stayed with me. But so John would have been there. Gary Williams would certainly be very high on the list. Gary and I have been friends again for 40 years. He's in the Hall of Fame, deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. and as I mentioned earlier during my talk, a Hall of Fame person. So he would certainly be on the list. Mike Rizzo would probably be a great interview, but we don't get along. So I don't think that's going to happen. I would love to interview Dan Snyder and ask him what it's like to be the worst owner in the history of sports, with the possible exception of James Dolan. That's not going to happen. I'll tell you one other, though, someone from the Washington football team, Doug Williams, who I got to know very well. I've known Doug since he played in Tampa, but I got to know him very well when I was working on a book called Quarterback several years ago. And he was a huge help. He's been a huge help to me with this book on race. And Doug is one of those guys who, because he has a Southern accent, people miss how smart he is. He's really, really, really smart.
It's really interesting. So question for you, you've written so many things, and we're all in this age of Zoom right now, or at least we are for this time. What was the audiobook process like for you? How was that different? What kind of variation on theme was that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it was different. As I said at the beginning, it was like nothing else I've ever done. And we myself and Bob Snyder, who did the production, it was really seat of the pants from the beginning. We were in the middle of the pandemic. I put together the list. Bob and I talked the list through. We agreed on these 5 people. Again, as I said earlier, partly because each of their experiences was unique, but also because they would talk to me. I was 99% sure they would all be willing to give me the kind of time I was asking for, because obviously, and that I felt they would be comfortable, that I wouldn't get cliched answers. And I think if you listen to the friends I've made, you won't hear very many cliched answers. The only problem I had in doing the interviews was when I would ask Mary Carillo a question, she would say, well, what do you think? I'd like to know what, and I'd say, Mary, we're not here to find out what I think. We're here to find out what you think. But that's Mary, because she's a born reporter. So the way we actually did it was we put together a production schedule, and I was able to slot all 5 people into those dates, and it was amazing that it worked out as well as it did. And we went and recorded it at a restaurant in Bethesda, and I'm very embarrassed I'm forgetting the name of the restaurant, because the owner was great to us, and I'd love to give him a plug right here. But we went and recorded there. It was in the morning, nobody was there, and we did it for 5 straight days, and it was really a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing it, but you're right, it was a unique experience. It's one I hope to have again.
That's great. What was your, I guess part of this is what was most effective for you in networking in your career to gain those relationships and that access, and what advice would you give to others?
Interesting question. A couple of things. I always made a point when covering team sports of getting to know assistant coaches, partly because they were often more willing to talk to you than a head coach, and they didn't have a PR guy or an SID trailing after them when you went to talk to them in a corner of a locker room or after practice or whatever it was. And also because I thought some of them were going to end up becoming head coaches, and many of them did, and many of them became big names. I think of Rick Barnes when he was here at George Mason as an assistant to Joe Harrington, and we became very good friends back then. Of course, I knew Krzyzewski when he was at Army. I knew Jim Valvano when he was at Iona. Now, they were head coaches, but at smaller programs. I always went and I still do. I love to go to games involving smaller programs. That's how I got to know Gary Williams. I went out to see American play at Fort Myer years ago. In fact, when Maryland won the national championship, I told the story about Krzyzewski and the Denny's, but when Maryland won the national championship in 2002, and I went out on the court to congratulate Gary, first thing he said to me was, come a long way from Fort Myer, haven't we? So guys remember that. Krzyzewski remembered the Denny's. Gary remembered Fort Myer. Rick Barnes remembered that I talked to him when he was an assistant at George Mason. And the other thing, and particularly in covering golf, one of the things that I just did early on, it wasn't like I did it consciously, but it worked for me. When I go on the driving range to talk to guys or on the putting green, I almost never open a notebook. I just walk up and start talking. Hey, how's your family? Or if I know somebody is a graduate of Florida State, because a lot of golfers I was friends with, Paul Azinger, Jeff Sluman, and others went to Florida State. We'll talk about their football team or their basketball team. One of my favorite moments in life was at the old Doral Open years ago. And it was early March, and I was standing on the range, and I was talking to Billy Andrade, who went to Wake Forest, Curtis Strange, who went to Wake Forest, Jeff Sluman, who went to Florida State, Davis Love, who went to North Carolina. And we were talking about the NCAA tournament. We were going back and forth. Finally, Andrade looks at me and he goes, you know, you're always out here giving us a hard time. Let's see you hit a golf ball. Let's see you hit a golf ball. And I'm saying, no, fellas, there's a reason I cover golf and don't play golf. No, you're going to hit a golf ball right now. He puts his 5-iron in my hands, and they all stand there. And for some reason, I walked up to the golf ball, and Sluman is yelling, 4 left, 4 right, you know, like I'm going to shank it. And I'm, oh my God, this is going to be humiliating. I think I literally shut my eyes, George. I hadn't swung a golf club since the previous September. This is March. Shut my eyes, swung the club, and I hit it so pure. I will never hit a shot more pure than that in my entire life.
That's beautiful.
I turned around, and they're all standing there with their mouths open like that. And Billy said, do that again. I said, oh no, drop the mic, drop the club, got out of there. That might be one of my great athletic achievements.
John, we have so many questions still, but we're going to wrap it up. We've stayed on schedule. You've been great about that. You really have, you have great recall, and these stories have been fascinating. So thank you for sharing them with us. We really appreciate it. We also want to thank Terry at TD Bank and for his support of this program and for his interest and effort around bringing this to be. So thanks on all that. And thanks to everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. We hope this was a welcome break in your normal schedules. And John, we look forward to talking to you at another time. Continue your great work. Thank you.
George, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to everybody who put this together. I hope people get a chance to listen to the friends I've made. And you're right about my memory. I can tell you all 26 members of the 69 Mets. Thing is, I can't remember what day it is.
You have to make space. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you. And John, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.